This is your second lecture for the first chapter in your textbook, looking at what is communication in general. In this lecture, we're going to look at the characteristics and myths of communication. So to start, we're going to talk about what are the 6 characteristics of communication in general. The first characteristic is that communication relies on multiple channels. When we talked about the models of communication, we looked at the channel in which the message is being transmitted, and we talked about there are both verbal and nonverbal channels. Even thinking about those models in general, we have kind of verbal, thinking about mass communication in the linear model. We have nonverbal communication. We can think about channels here being like eye contact, vocalics, thinking about touching, gestures, all of those things. So when we think about this characteristic of communication relying on multiple channels, we know that different communication situations can use more than one channel, and we would call this a channel-rich situation or interaction or context. So a channel-rich context is a interaction that relies on or uses multiple channels to send information. So when we think about face-to-face communication, we can really think about this as being a very channel-rich type of communication. We are oftentimes using verbal language. We can rely on many different nonverbal channels during those interactions. So when we have access and we're using lots of different channels to send a message, this would be an example of a channel-rich context. But we also have interactions when we talked about those models. I used some examples of channel lean contexts where there's less channels that are being used. So things like text messaging, we don't have access to a lot of the nonverbal or any of the nonverbal channels. We try to make up through some of that through things like emojis, but it's not the same as using, having access to smells, having access to kind of those eye contact or eye behaviors or facial expressions. So really thinking about, posture not being there in a text message. So when we are using, things like mass communication, text messaging, email, all of those things generally rely on one channel, and oftentimes that's the verbal channel or the written channel. And these things are those contexts or those situations would be channel lean contexts. And so there's multiple, the first characteristic is that there's multiple channels. And these, when we're thinking about using channels to communicate, we can think about, when we don't use a lot of channels, we're talking about channel lean interactions. When we are using multiple channels, we're talking about channel rich interactions. Communication also passes through perceptual filters. So when we are engaging in the decoding process, we are filtering those incoming messages through our own perceptions about the world, through our experiences interacting with that person or in that context. We have biases that we'll talk about, stereotypes, things of that nature, stigmas. We have beliefs about many different things that all of these things really influence how we're going to interpret that message. And we'll talk a lot about that when we talk about the perception in this course later in one of your chapters. People give communication its meaning. So as we think about words and gestures, we think about the different words in our language and the gestures that we use. All of these things are really just symbols that humans, that people using that language have assigned a certain meaning to. So we know that the mouse on your computer is termed a mouse because we've assigned meaning to that. And these meanings can change over time. So as we think about the 1800s or the early 1900s, a mouse was simply just a rodent, an animal, a nuisance perhaps. And as our technology advances, we have assigned the symbol mouse to something else, to that computer device. And so meanings to words can change. We can have multiple meanings when we think about certain words or symbols in our language. So we can also think about multiple meanings in terms of the literal and relational meanings of a message. So when we think about the literal meaning, so what I'm actually saying, we're really focusing on the content dimension. So information are you providing? You may say, I love you, and that is providing very specific information about your feelings that would be the content, the literal kind of meaning of that phrase. But we also have relational dimensions. And so when you communicate with people, we are providing information about the nature of our relationship. So thinking about, when I say I love you, you're also communicating oftentimes care and respect, certain level of trust in that relationship. And so those are all things that are tied to the relational dimension. We all know when you're in a romantic relationship, that phrase "I love you" is pretty loaded, right? And so when we think about the power of that message in a romantic relationship, we think about the kind of pop culture representations of who says I love you first and what that means and who has the power in the relationship. All of those things are really referring to the relational meaning and not the literal meaning of those three words. When we think about things like meta communication, so meta communication is communication about how we communicate. We're often focusing on relational meanings. So, when you think about, you have an argument, and you talk about, well, when you said this or when you raised your voice, that made me feel like this. All of that is an example of how a meta communication interaction would go. That is really tied to some of those relational components. We send messages whether they are intentional or unintentional. So when we think about oftentimes miscommunication, we can think about maybe some of the instances in which we unintentionally send a message or it is interpreted in a way that we didn't really intend. This can happen with both verbal and nonverbal communication and channels. And so also thinking about intentional meanings for both content and relational dimensions here. And finally, communication is governed by rules. So thinking about the rules that tell us what behavior is preferred in an interaction. We talked in the models of communication, the previous lecture, I really focused on, some of the rules that go on in kind of a classroom setting, right? When a student wants to speak, oftentimes you raise your hand. So that is a rule that governs your behavior in that context, in that interaction. We have rules within our friendships, within our romantic relationships, within our family relationships, and we'll talk about those rules when we talk about each of those relationships. Rules prohibit certain behaviors as well. And so in some relationships, for example, an unspoken rule in one of my family relationships with my parents is that I, don't cuss, right? I really like to cuss. If you meet me in person or you have me in class, sometimes I slip and cuss in class because I really like it. I like the way cussing makes me feel. But in my relationships, in my interactions with my parents, that is an unspoken rule that I don't cuss with them like I would with my husband. We have carried that rule with our son now that he's talking and picking up. He's a little parrot, and we kind of have this rule that we've toned down in kind of monitoring our language around him. And so those are some rules that govern our interactions when our son is in the room. I said that these can be implicit things. Oftentimes we can set rules that are expected to be followed, but we don't explicitly state. And we also have explicit rules. So, when you're talking or you're even thinking about some of the course policies that I went over in that Getting Started lecture about kind of communicate rules for email and how to get a hold of me, those are explicitly stated. I told you explicitly how kind of you should get a hold of me and what's the best way. This class really centers on interpersonal communication. Communication in our relationships is really where we're going to center that. And interpersonal communication has some specific characteristics of its own. So communication is highly intimate, occurring between two people, or it can be mundane interactions. We'll talk about some of the different intimate and mundane interactions when we talk about some of the different relationships. But really we're talking about communication between two people. We're not talking about group communication communication. We're not talking about mass communication. There are different courses for both of those types of communication. In this class, we're talking about communication in our relationships between two people, in our friendships, and our romantic relationships, and our family relationships, and our coworker relationships. Interpersonal communication occurs within relationships, right? So when we think about relationships, we don't necessarily have to think about them as being like our most intimate or our most strong bonds that we have. We can also think about, and I'll use these examples. So we think about relationships with classmates, with coworkers, with acquaintances. They're still interpersonal, but they maybe aren't our most intimate relationships. And the communication things that we'll talk about in this course do apply to those relationships, and we'll talk about some of them explicitly. But when we think about things like disclosure, the relationship and how intimate that relationship is does influence things like the breadth and depth of those disclosures, and we'll talk about those as well. Interpersonal communication evolves within relationships. So when we first meet somebody, how we communicate with them is likely going to be different than when we've known somebody for 10 or 15 years. So communication with close others changes over the course of the relationship. We'll talk about some of the different stages of relationships and formation, maintenance, dissolution, or ending of relationships. And so we'll talk about some of those changes over time and how our communication changes. And interpersonal communication negotiates and defines our relationships. So we use interpersonal communication to negotiate kind of what the relationship is, the rules of the relationship, and that oftentimes determines the evolution of our relationship. So kind of defining what we are. Are we acquaintances? Are we classmates? Are we friends? Are we best friends? Are we dating? Are we casually hooking up? Are we seeing other people? Are we exclusive? Are we boyfriend and girlfriend? Or are we engaged? Are we married? So really thinking about communication influences the evolution of our relationships. It defines what the relationship is. And so as we think about this negotiation and this definition is really a function of the rules that we set up, the norms that we have, and the boundaries that we establish in our relationships. And so lastly, your chapter talked about some myths of communication, and I want to go over those a little bit right now. Oftentimes students come into the course with some of these myths that they hold. One myth that I find is that students think that, communication is intuitive, that they already have a lot of this knowledge. And then when we get to the end of the course, you'll find that you had some of the base knowledge, but we're really going to extend on a lot of that and dive into some of the complexities. And so this really goes into that first one here, that everyone is an expert in communication. And just because we have experience with a process or with a behavior does not mean that we have expertise or competence. And so we're going to, in the next sequence lecture for chapter 1, we'll really talk a lot about competence, and you'll see that there's a lot that goes into how we can communicate effectively in our interpersonal relationships. Communication cannot solve every problem or any problem. Sometimes there are problems that just can't be fixed. When we think about things like serial arguments that we have over and over and over and over again, sometimes in those situations, communication is the problem. And so when we think about number 3, communication breaking down, it's not necessarily the communication that's breaking down, but it is the lack of effective communication. So it's not necessarily the communication itself that breaks down, but it's not having kind of the competence or the ability. Maybe there's noise occurring. And so thinking about communication as a process, it evolves, it's not static. And so that is important to remember as we think about this third myth. Communication is inherently good. Going back to sometimes communication is the problem. Sometimes communication can be used for ill purposes. So thinking about things like bullying or gossip, we can think about those are communication behaviors, but they're not always used for good. And so we can really disprove that myth there. And the fifth myth that your chapter talked about is that more communication is always better. And we know that this isn't necessarily true. And that example I gave earlier in terms of serial arguments, continuing to argue about that, an issue that isn't resolvable can actually have a detriment to the relationship. It can make the interactions worse. When we think about conflict, we'll talk about sometimes there are situations when avoiding is a very useful tool. When we think about kind of miscommunication, or when we think about maybe like oversharing, right? And so, sometimes you're like, I didn't really need to know that. And so that would be another kind of example of when this more communication isn't always the best thing. So, in this lecture, we talked about the characteristics of communication, of interpersonal communication specifically, and thinking about the myths. In the final component of Chapter 1, we will talk about communication competence.